wind that swept through Willow Hollow that morning carried no scent of danger. It rustled the dry grasses and whispered through the cottonwoods, same as it had for 100 years. The sky was a hard blue, the color of hammered steel, and the sun had just begun its climb when Mary Lou Carter stepped out of her cabin with a pail in one hand and a rifle in the other. Life on the edge of the frontier demanded that kind of multitasking. Her boots crunched the frost-crusted dirt as she made her way to the pump. Behind her, the sound of her daughter Clara's voice floated from the cabin window, singing softly, off-key and sweet, to a patchwork doll with one button eye. Mary Lou allowed herself a brief smile. Clara, barely 12, had never lost her gentleness, even after the fever took her father last winter. That kind of softness was rare out here, and more fragile than most folks knew. By noon, the air turned warm, and the ranch hummed with chores. Mary Lou fixed a broken fence post, pausing now and then to scan the horizon. It had become a habit since the sheriff stopped patrolling past Sundown Ridge. She didn't trust that man to water a cactus, let alone defend a woman and her child from what crept beyond the hills. Still, she hadn't seen any real trouble in nearly a year. The land had a way of growing quiet before something wicked woke it. She spotted the dust trail first. Far off, where the sun painted the canyon walls in burnt orange and blood. A single rider, maybe two. They didn't follow the road into town, nor the cattle paths used by traders. These were men with different maps. Her stomach tightened. She turned and called out to Clara, trying to sound casual. "Sup'll be early, honey. Wash up in the trough soon as you're done." The girl's face appeared in the doorway, curious. "Is someone coming, Mama?" Mary Lou nodded gently. "Just keep inside till I holler." She waited by the barn, the rifle hidden behind a trough, the pail still swinging in her hand, like nothing was amiss. The riders never came closer. They circled once at a distance, then turned back west, vanishing into the bluffs like smoke. She didn't sleep much that night. Neither did the old hound under the porch, his ears twitching at every groan in the wind. The next day passed without incident, and the day after. But on the third morning, the chickens scattered from the coop at dawn, and by the time Mary Lou grabbed her rifle, the sky was already black with smoke. She ran barefoot through the yard, heart pounding. The world turned red and hot. The cabin, her home, roared with flame. The roof caved in as she watched, screaming Clara's name. Gunshots cracked like thunder, echoing off the canyon. She fired blindly into the blaze, then ducked behind the woodpile as a bullet splintered the post beside her. Men on horseback, 5, maybe 6, faces covered in dust masks, hats pulled low. They moved with practiced cruelty, tossing lanterns, smashing windows, hooting like devils. One of them rode past with a girl slung over the saddle, kicking, thrashing. Clara. Mary Lou bolted forward, firing again. She didn't feel the shot that struck her shoulder until she hit the dirt. The men didn't even bother to finish her off. One spat in her direction. Another muttered, "Leave the witch. Let the fire handle her." They rode off, Clara's screams fading into the wind. Time lost meaning after that. The fire didn't kill her. The wound didn't bleed her out. Something deeper kept her breathing, something cold and relentless. She crawled through ash and broken glass, teeth gritted, skin scorched. She found the trough overturned, water muddied with soot, and pressed her face into it. Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned indigo, she saw movement along the ridge. A lone figure stood there, outlined by the dying light, tall and still as stone, with a wide hat shadowing his face. He watched in silence, unmoving even as the fire crackled and the cinders danced like ghosts. A horse behind him shifted its weight, but the man remained fixed, like a monument built before time knew fear. She tried to cry out. Her voice rasped raw, then died. The man did not descend. He only watched. Then, with a whisper of dust, he turned and vanished behind the hill, swallowed by twilight. Mary Lou slumped against the trough, the cold from the water seeping into her bones. Clara was gone. Her home was ash. And in the darkening silence, she knew one thing without doubt. The men who did this would not stop. They'd ride again into someone else's peace and ruin it with flame and steel. Unless someone stopped them. She didn't know who the man on the ridge was, or why he hadn't helped, but something in the way he stood, the way even fire seemed to keep its distance, told her he wasn't done watching. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for something, or someone. The wound had scabbed over ugly and deep by the time Mary Lou opened her eyes to the gray light of morning. Ash still clung to her skin. Every breath scraped like grit against her lungs. Her shoulder pulsed with pain, her lips cracked and dry. She wasn't dead, though the land around her looked like hell had swept through and never bothered to clean up. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. The world had gone on. That was the cruelest part. She crawled until her limbs gave out beneath a twisted juniper tree. There she lay in the dirt, skin blistered, face streaked with soot. She thought of Clara, her voice, her doll, her stubborn laugh. The hollow left in her chest ached harder than the wound. Then came the hoofbeats. At first, she thought them a trick of memory, the sound of the raiders returning to finish the job. But this rhythm was slower, purposeful, not the reckless thunder of killers. A single horse stepped into view, its coat of pale buckskin brushed with dust. Behind it walked the man she'd seen on the ridge. He was taller than she remembered, wore a faded duster that trailed behind like shadow. His face was tanned and lean, jaw lined with gray stubble, and his eyes, a muted green, seemed to measure everything in silence. He had no rifle, no badge, just a coil of rope, a canteen, and a saddlebag slung over one shoulder. She tried to sit up. Pain lanced through her, and she cursed low under her breath. "You saw what happened," she rasped. "Why didn't you help?" He didn't answer. He crouched beside her without a word and offered the canteen. She drank until her throat stopped burning. Then he gently lifted her arm and inspected the wound. His hands moved with care, worn, but not rough. Not the hands of a killer. Not anymore, at least. "You deaf," she snapped, though her voice held less venom than she meant. "Or just too good to speak to the likes of me?" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of cloth, soaked in something bitter, pressed it to her shoulder. She winced, gritting her teeth. "I ain't afraid of pain," she muttered. Still, he said nothing. He cleaned the wound, wrapped it with a tight, practiced hand, then lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. He placed her on the horse, swung up behind her, and guided them toward the distant hills without once asking where she wanted to go. She didn't protest. She didn't have anywhere left. They rode in silence through the canyon spine, where stone walls closed in tight, like the ribs of a buried beast. Shadows slid over them, and wind moaned through narrow crevices. Ravens wheeled overhead. Hours passed. The man never looked back. By dusk, they arrived at a small shack tucked between two broken cliffs. It wasn't much, just a lean-to with a chimney of stacked stone and a fence built for horses, but it stood, and it held life. Several horses grazed nearby, sleek and healthy, their ears twitching as the two approached. One nickered softly, and the man let it nuzzle his shoulder before leading Mary Lou inside. He laid her down on a cot of old quilts, lit a fire, boiled water. He worked in silence, moving with a steady rhythm, as though every step had been etched into him long ago. She watched him from the corner of her eye. "You got a name?" "Nothing. I can't rightly call you, hey, you forever." He stirred something into a tin mug, bitter herbs and steam, and handed it to her. She drank. It settled warm in her gut. "I'm Mary Lou Carter. My daughter's name is Clara. Those bastards took her. The McCrae gang, I reckon. You heard of them." His jaw twitched. "Just barely." She saw it. "So you do know them?" Still, he said nothing. She stared into the fire. "They think I'm dead. That gives me a start. I aim to use it." He looked up then. His eyes met hers, deep, unreadable. Then he turned and rummaged through a chest by the wall. He drew out a map. Old. Hand-drawn. It showed a network of ridges, canyons, and dried riverbeds branching like veins. He pointed to a place far to the west, near a jagged line labeled Devil's Saddle. "You think they're there?" He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just watched her. "And you're going to help me?" He walked to the door, whistled low, and two horses trotted forward. Not the buckskin from before. Different mounts. Leaner. Faster. You got a plan." He picked up a piece of charcoal and scratched a symbol on the edge of the map, a narrow cut in the canyon wall. A pass. "You know those trails?" A pause. Then finally he nodded. She stared at him, and slowly, a shape began to form in her mind. The way he moved, the way he didn't speak, the way the horses listened like kinfolk. She remembered a story she'd heard once in a saloon, long before Clara was born, about a cavalry scout who led men through an ambush at Bison Hill, came out alone, wounded in body and mind, never spoke again. Folks called him the silent herdsman, a man who'd once spoken to generals and horses alike before something broke in him. "You're him, aren't you?" His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. She leaned forward, despite the pain. "Why me? Why help now?" He reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a small, handmade doll with one button eye. Clara's. Her breath caught. He must have found it in the ashes, maybe even before she woke. He'd carried it with him. That alone said more than 1,000 words. The fire popped. Mary Lou clenched her fists. "I'll need a rifle." He walked to a trunk near the stove and opened it. Inside lay a Henry repeater, its wood polished and clean. He handed it to her without hesitation. She took it. "I'm not going to beg," she said quietly, "but I'm not going alone. You know that land. You know how they think. You can help me bring her back." He didn't speak. Didn't need to. When he turned back to the fire, he began rolling cartridges into a leather bandolier. The horses outside stamped in the dirt, sensing something stirring in the air. They would ride at dawn. They rode out beneath a violet sky laced with stars, just before the first edge of dawn cracked the horizon. The world was quiet, heavy with expectation. Mary Lou's shoulder ached with every jolt of the saddle, but she kept her mouth shut and her rifle ready. The silent herdsman rode just ahead, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, his coat whipping softly in the morning wind. The map he'd marked burned fresh in her mind. Devil's Saddle, a jagged cleft in the western hills, long rumored to be a hideout for the worst kind of men. She'd never dared ride that far. Most folks avoided the place like they would a nest of rattlers. Even the law stayed out. But that's where the McCrae gang had gone, and where Clara was being held, if she was still alive. The trail twisted through stone and scrub, narrowing until they had to ride single file, hooves clattering on rock. A hawk screeched overhead. Somewhere in the shadows, a coyote howled, then fell silent. Time passed in slow, dry hours. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. By midday, they reached a dry riverbed scattered with mule bones and rusted tin. The herdsman dismounted and held up a hand. Mary Lou followed his gaze. At the top of a bluff, half hidden behind mesquite, was a man on lookout, lean, long rifle in hand, scanning the distance. The herdsman motioned low, fingers flicking like sign language. He pointed left, toward a narrow cut in the canyon wall. Mary Lou nodded, dismounted, and followed on foot, keeping low, her boots silent on the sand. They crept through the cut, each footstep deliberate. The silence between them was not empty. It was alive, threaded with tension and shared resolve. The herdsman stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop. Below them stretched a hollowed basin, surrounded by stone teeth. In the center stood the camp, tents, fires, and a corral with half a dozen stolen horses. And near the biggest tent, a cage made of iron and rope. Clara. Mary Lou's breath caught. Her daughter sat inside, dirty but upright, knees pulled to her chest. A guard leaned nearby, chewing on jerky, rifle across his lap. The herdsman knelt beside her, took out a piece of charcoal, and drew a quick sketch on the inside of his hat brim, marking positions, paths, guards. Mary Lou studied it, then met his eyes. "I'll draw him to the west," she whispered. "When they move, you cut around, get Clara out." He frowned. "You got a better plan?" she asked. His brow furrowed, but he didn't object. He simply handed her a small pouch, gunpowder, from the smell, and a long fuse. She gave him a tight nod, then slipped down the slope like a fox through brush. Minutes later, a sharp whistle rang out. Then a second. Voices rose. Someone shouted, Mary Lou struck Flint a fuse and shoved the pouch beneath an old wagon near the supply crates. She darted back into the rocks. The explosion shattered the quiet like a thunderclap. Fire and smoke bloomed skyward. Men scrambled, shouting over one another, guns drawn. Horses screamed and kicked at their rails. She fired once, then twice, hitting a lantern and setting another tent ablaze. The camp panicked, chasing shadows, firing at echoes. And in the chaos, the silent herdsman moved. He was a phantom, slipping between tents, ducking behind crates. He reached the cage, drew a blade from his boot, and cut the rope binding the gate. Clara backed away, terrified, until she saw his eyes. He held up the doll, and her breath hitched. Recognition dawned. She nodded. He scooped her up and vanished into the smoke. Mary Lou covered their escape, picking off 2 men from the ridge. The others fired wild into the dust, but none followed. The camp was too shaken, too disoriented to mount a chase. By the time the smoke began to clear, mother and daughter were halfway up the canyon trail, galloping hard, the herdsman riding ahead like a shade. They didn't stop until the sun touched the rim of the world. They made camp in a narrow defile flanked by rock. Mary Lou held Clara close, running fingers through her hair, whispering thanks against her temple. Clara wept quietly, but her hands clung to her mother like roots to earth. The herdsman tended the fire, his back to them, giving space but never far. His horses, alert and ready, flanked the camp as though they knew what was coming next. Because it wasn't over, the McCrae gang wouldn't let it be. "You think they'll chase us?" Mary Lou asked quietly, eyes never leaving her daughter. The herdsman looked up. In the firelight, his face was lined with something hard and ancient. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He stood, walked to his saddlebag, and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were badges, old, tarnished, bent. One bore the star of the U.S. Cavalry. Another, the iron brand of the Pinkerton Agency. A third was snapped in half, blood-stained and blackened by fire. Mary Lou stared. "You used to hunt men like them." He met her eyes. For the first time, she saw the grief behind his silence, the weight of something long buried. Not cowardice, not guilt, just weariness older than the trail. "You done with that life?" she asked. His eyes flicked to Clara, then to the stars. Then slowly, deliberately, he picked up the old Henry repeater, wiped its barrel with oil, and began to load fresh rounds. Mary Lou watched him, then stood. Her hands were still trembling, but she picked up her own rifle, checked the chamber. "We make a stand here." He didn't answer, but he didn't say no. That night, Clara curled into the crook of her mother's arm, exhausted, safe for now. The fire burned low, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called again. Mary Lou looked to the herdsman. "If they come, we end it." He gave a slow, grim nod. She stared into the fire, jaw set, heart hardening. "I'm tired of running." At dawn, the desert was quiet again, too quiet. No wind, no birdsong, not even the stir of dust along the canyon wall. The sun crept over the ridge like an executioner, slow and merciless. Mary Lou knelt by the fire pit, brushing cold ash with her fingers. She'd barely slept. Clara was still curled in the bedroll, cheeks streaked with soot. One hand clutched around the doll, like it was her last anchor to innocence. The herdsman had not moved from his post atop the bluff. He stood like a carved sentinel, one hand resting lightly on his rifle, the other at his side, still as stone. His horse waited below, reins loose, muscles taut. Even the animals seemed to know what was coming. They heard the riders, just after the sun cleared the ridgeline. The McCrae gang didn't bother with stealth. They came loud, hoofbeats pounding the ground, shouting, whooping, firing warning shots. Dust rose behind them like a funeral shroud. There were 8 of them now, more than before. Word must have spread. Revenge drew men like flies to rot. Mary Lou stood slowly, rifle in hand. Her knees ached. Her arms felt heavy. But when Clara stirred and whispered, "Mama," her spine straightened. "I'm here," she said. "You stay down. Whatever happens, don't run." Clara nodded, her face pale but steady. The herdsman descended without a word. He checked the saddle straps, slung the repeater across his back, then handed Mary Lou a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were cartridges, neat and polished. One of them bore a carved cross. "For him?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded. They took position just behind the brush line, where the canyon narrowed, Devil's Saddle's last choke point. It was the only place the riders could funnel through, and the perfect ground to make a stand. The outlaws appeared over the ridge like vultures, lean and filthy, their faces twisted with anticipation. Jeb McCrae led them, broad-shouldered and scarred, wearing Clara's locket around his neck like a trophy. He pulled up first, his horse stamping nervously. "Well, well," Jeb called, grinning wide. "Didn't think you had it in you, widow." Mary Lou stepped forward, rifle steady. "Let the rest ride off, Jeb. You stay. I'll put you in the ground." He laughed, eyes flicking to the herdsman. "Ain't he the quiet one from town? Thought he was just some broken drifter. Guess we were wrong. He's got more fight than all of you," she said. "He doesn't need to talk to end men." Jeb's grin faltered, just slightly. The silence between both sides thickened. Tension crackled in the air. Then someone fired. Chaos erupted. Dust flew as horses screamed and men shouted. Bullets slammed into stone, kicking up shards. Mary Lou dropped one rider with a shot through the neck. Another tried flanking the canyon wall. He caught the herdsman's knife in his gut before he even raised his pistol. Jeb bellowed orders, but they came too late. The choke point worked just as they'd hoped. The outlaws had no room to maneuver, no shelter to hide behind. The herdsman moved like smoke, silent, fluid, deadly. He fired 3 times, each round finding its mark. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. One of the McCrae brothers tried to ride him down. He ducked under the swing, pulled the man from the saddle, and snapped his neck against a rock. Mary Lou fought like a woman possessed. Every bullet she fired was a reckoning, every breath a promise to Clara. When the dust finally settled, 6 lay dead. Only Jeb remained. He staggered back, bleeding from the leg, pistol trembling. He glanced behind him, his horse gone, his men gone. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed, stumbling. Mary Lou stepped forward, barrel aimed at his heart. "I know exactly." Jeb raised his pistol, desperate, hand shaking. The herdsman was faster. One shot, center of the chest. Jeb fell like a sack of grain, the locket snapping free and tumbling into the dirt. Mary Lou walked over, picked it up, opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was the tiny sketch Clara had drawn, just 2 stick figures and a sun. It was faded, but still whole. She held it tight, like a vow, then turned back. The herdsman was already mounting his horse. "You're leaving?" she asked. He nodded once. She stepped closer. "You saved her. You saved both of us." He tipped his hat, eyes soft but unreadable. Mary Lou's voice caught. "What's your name?" He paused. Then, in a voice that hadn't spoken in years, low and worn as the canyon wind, he said, "Call me Silas." Then he rode. No fanfare, no farewell, just the soft rhythm of hooves fading into legend. Days later, folks in Willow Hollow spoke in hushed tones of the outlaws who burned a home and stole a girl, and the silent man who brought her back. Some said he was a ghost of the old frontier. Others swore he'd once been a Pinkerton who lost everything in a fire. Mary Lou never told. She rebuilt her cabin from scorched earth, planted new seeds, taught Clara to ride, to shoot, to survive. And every dusk, she'd look west, toward Devil's Saddle, and wonder if Silas still roamed the high ridges, watching the land like a forgotten guardian. She figured some men didn't need graves. They just needed stories.